Many of us remember the B-29 as the invincible silver giant, outcosting even the atomic bomb, built to strike with surgical precision. But on a cold night in 1945, it faced an enemy no one anticipated, the jet stream. Imagine flying the world's most advanced plane only to be shoved backward by winds that defied every calculation. At 30,000 feet, our high-tech bomb sights failed. Victory wasn't guaranteed. Every second, every decision could mean disaster. To survive, pilots had to abandon their high-altitude comfort, strip their planes of guns, and descend into the literal fire. Tonight, we reveal the untold story of how air warnings, once ignored, guided the B-29s safely to Tokyo. This wasn't luck. This was a radical gamble that changed the face of aerial warfare forever.
History often remembers the B-29 Superfortress as the silver giant that ended the war, a $3 billion marvel of engineering that promised to bring an empire to its knees from the safety of the stratosphere. Many of us remember the grainy footage of these pressurized behemoths, looking almost peaceful as they glided through the clouds. We were told they were invincible, and on paper they were. They could fly higher than any Japanese fighter could climb and carried the legendary Norden bomb sight, a device so precise it was said to be able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. Nature doesn't care about a $3 billion price tag, and as our boys would soon find out, the sky over Japan held a secret that no scientist in Washington had predicted. In November 1944, during the first mass assault on Tokyo, 94 superfortresses turned east over Mount Fuji, ready to deliver their payload. The crews checked their instruments, expecting a standard run. Suddenly, the pilots felt a violent shove from behind. To their absolute shock, they found themselves roaring past landmarks at ground speeds of nearly 450 miles per hour, almost 100 miles per hour faster than the plane's theoretical top speed. They hadn't found a shortcut. They had stumbled into a high-altitude river of air we now know as the jet stream. Imagine trying to hit a moving target while standing on a speeding train. That was the reality for the bombardiers. These winds, screaming at over 200 miles per hour, made the pickle barrel precision of the Norden bomb sight utterly useless. Of the more than 1,000 bombs dropped that day, only 48 fell anywhere near the target. The invincible superfortress wasn't being defeated by enemy fire, but an invisible wall of wind that literally blew their mission off course. The military command was faced with a devastating realization. The very high-altitude strategy the B-29 was built for was failing. The silver wings were there, the crews were the best we had, but the results were non-existent. Something had to change, or the war in the Pacific would drag on for years. This failure is what set the stage for one of the most controversial and brutal tactical pivots in military history, a move that would take the superfortress out of the clouds and bring it screaming down to the deck. To understand the sheer scale of what was at stake, you have to look past the aluminum and the engines and look at the ledger. In the 1940s, the United States was pouring money into the war effort at a rate that would make a modern banker's head spin. But even in that era of unchecked spending, one project stood above the rest. It wasn't the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. That came in second at $2 billion. No, the most expensive single gamble of World War II was the B-29 Superfortress, costing a staggering $3 billion. Many of us might remember the B-29 as a success, but at the time, it was a desperate, unproven bet that American engineering could solve a problem no one else even dared to touch. The problem wasn't just building a bigger plane, it was building a plane that could do the impossible. Fly from distant island bases, cross thousands of miles of ocean, and drop a bomb with pinpoint accuracy from 6 miles up in the air. This wasn't just a bomber, it was a pressurized, remote-controlled computer with wings. The heart of this $3 billion gamble was the Norden bomb sight. History suggests that the military's faith in this device bordered on the religious. It was a complex mechanical analog computer that allowed the bombardier to take over the flight controls of the aircraft during the final run. The theory was simple. If you could account for the wind, the altitude, and the speed, you could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. This precision bombing doctrine was the cornerstone of American air power. We weren't looking to level cities, we were looking to take out a single factory, a single bridge, or a single power plant, all while staying out of reach of the Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighters.
To achieve this, Boeing had to invent technologies that didn't exist. They used high-strength aluminum alloys and flush riveting to create a skin so smooth it cut through the air like a knife. Because the crews had to operate at altitudes where the air is too thin to breathe, they created the first fully pressurized production bomber. The pilot, co-pilot, and navigator sat in a front pod connected to the gunners in the back by a long, cramped tunnel that ran over the massive bomb bays. Even the guns were high-tech, because you couldn't put a human in a turret at those altitudes without them freezing or suffocating. They developed a General Electric fire control system. A gunner could sit in a pressurized seat and use a remote sighting station to aim turrets located elsewhere on the plane. It was the birth of automated warfare. The gamble wasn't just about the money, it was about a total commitment to a specific way of winning the war. We bet $3 billion that high-altitude precision was the answer. We trained 58,000 workers, many of whom were housewives and farmers who had never seen an airplane up close, to build the most complex machine in history in just 90 days of training. We built massive new factories and pushed unproven R-3350 engines into the field before they were ready, leading to engine fires that claimed the lives of entire test crews. But as the first B-29s finally touched down in India and the Marianas in 1944, the men flying them were about to discover that all the technology in the world can't account for a nature that refuses to cooperate. In the early 1940s, we believed we had mastered the heavens. The Norden bomb sight was more than a tool, it was a symbol of American ingenuity, a complex arrangement of gyroscopes and gears that promised a clean surgical end to the conflict. The crews of the B-29 were the elite, flying a machine that cost more than the development of the atomic bomb. They sat in their pressurized cabins, miles above the earth, feeling like gods looking down on a world that couldn't touch them. They had the best training, the best optics, and a $3 billion investment at their backs. The expectation was simple: fly over the target, line up the crosshairs, and let the mechanical brain of the Norden do the rest. The pickle barrel precision we had practiced over the clear, predictable deserts of the American Southwest became a tragic joke the moment those silver wings crossed the Japanese coastline. As the B-29s climbed to their operational ceiling of 30,000 feet, they didn't encounter a clear path. They flew headlong into a ghost. Imagine you are a bombardier. You've spent months perfecting your timing. You look through the telescope of the Norden, peering through a small glass window at a target 6 miles below. You've accounted for the plane's speed and the drop time. But as you cross into the airspace over Honshu, the world outside begins to warp. Your instruments tell you that your airspeed is steady, yet your ground speed, the speed at which you are actually moving across the terrain, suddenly doubles. One moment you are cruising, the next you are being catapulted across the sky at nearly 500 miles per hour. This was the jet stream, a phenomenon that was practically unknown to Western meteorology at the time. To the crews in the sky, it felt like an invisible hand was grabbing the plane and hurling it forward. In other instances, the wind would hit them from the side, pushing the massive B-29 sideways so violently that the Norden's gyroscopes couldn't compensate. The math that made the Norden bomb sight work was instantly rendered obsolete.
The device functioned on the assumption of relatively stable air, or at the very least, wind speeds that didn't exceed the aircraft's own capabilities. But when the wind is blowing at 200 miles per hour, a bomb dropped from 30,000 feet doesn't just fall, it drifts. It gets carried miles away from the intended factory or shipyard. History suggests that the results of these early missions were nothing short of a disaster for the High Command. During a major raid on the Musashino aircraft engine plant, a primary target for the Air Force, the precision was non-existent. Over 100 B-29s dropped their payloads, but thanks to the invisible wall of the jet stream, only a handful of bombs actually struck the factory grounds. Most landed in the sea or in empty fields, miles from their mark. The $3 billion gamble was failing, not because the plane was bad or the crews were weak, but because we were trying to fight a war in a part of the atmosphere we didn't yet understand. The men in the cockpits felt the frustration deeply. They were flying the most advanced machine ever built, yet they were helpless as a leaf in a storm. They would return to the Marianas after 16 hours of grueling flight, exhausted and demoralized, having accomplished nothing but burning thousands of gallons of precious fuel. The invincible Superfortress had been humbled by the very air it was designed to conquer. The failure of the precision doctrine created a vacuum in leadership. The high-altitude daylight bombing runs were yielding zero results, and the pressure from Washington was mounting. They needed a win. They needed the B-29 to justify its existence.
This is where the human element of war took a dark turn. The failure of the technology led to a change in the man behind the desk. General Haywood Hansel, a staunch believer in the gentlemanly art of precision bombing, was replaced. Into his seat stepped a man with a very different philosophy, Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay didn't care about the pickle barrel. He didn't care about the Norden bomb site's reputation. He looked at the data and saw that the high-altitude winds were an obstacle that could not be bypassed. He realized that if the wind was the enemy at 30,000 feet, the only solution was to stop flying at 30,000 feet. It was a decision that would lead to one of the most harrowing nights in the history of human conflict, the moment the Air Force decided to trade its precision for a flamethrower. If you had walked onto the crushed coral runways of Tinian or Guam in early March 1945, you would have felt a tension so thick it was palpable. The men of the 21st Bomber Command were exhausted. For months they had played by the rules, flying at 30,000 feet, shivering in pressurized suits, and watching their bombs disappear into the clouds or get whipped away by the jet stream. They were operating the most expensive weapon in human history, yet they were failing. The old man back in Washington, General Hap Arnold, was losing patience. He didn't want excuses about wind speeds. He wanted results, and he knew just the man to deliver them. Major General Curtis LeMay wasn't interested in making minor adjustments. He was a man who believed that if a machine isn't working, you don't just kick it, you rebuild it. He sat in his headquarters, chewing on a cigar, looking at the grim statistics of the previous months. He saw that the high-altitude daylight raids were only hitting their targets about 5% of the time. He also knew that the Japanese anti-aircraft fire was lethal at 30,000 feet, but their night-fighting capabilities were almost non-existent. In a move that many of his own officers thought was a suicide mission, LeMay issued a set of orders that defied every manual in the Air Force. He told his crews they were going back to Tokyo, but this time they weren't going to hide in the clouds. They were going in at 5,000 to 9,000 feet, low enough to see the rooftops, low enough for small arms fire to reach them. The strategy shifted from surgical precision to raw, overwhelming volume. But the altitude change was only the beginning. To make this work, LeMay needed to squeeze every ounce of performance out of the B-29. In what became known as the radical gamble, he ordered the crews to strip the aircraft of nearly all their defensive armament. Think about that for a second. These men were being asked to fly into the heart of the enemy's capital at low altitude in a plane that had been essentially disarmed.
They removed the heavy remote-controlled turrets, the mountains of .50 caliber ammunition, and even the gunners themselves, leaving only the tail guns for a last-ditch defense. The logic was cold and mathematical. Less weight meant less strain on the temperamental Wright 3350 engines, which were notorious for catching fire during the long climb to 30,000 feet. More importantly, every pound of lead and steel removed was a pound of incendiary bombs added. By stripping the guns, LeMay doubled the bomb load. Each B-29 would now carry 7 tons of fire. This wasn't just about weight, it was about a fundamental shift in the moral and tactical landscape of the war. By going low and going at night, LeMay was abandoning the precision doctrine entirely. He wasn't aiming for a specific factory anymore. He was aiming for the Meetinghouse, the code name for the densely packed wooden residential districts of Tokyo. He knew that the Japanese war machine relied on a cottage industry where thousands of families manufactured small engine parts in their own homes. To LeMay, the city itself was the factory. The air crews were terrified. When the briefings began on March 9th, the silence in the Quonset huts was deafening. They were being told to fly individual routes, not in formation, at altitudes they usually reserved for landing. They were told there would be no fighter escort. Many of them wrote final letters home that morning, convinced they were being sent into a slaughterhouse. History suggests that LeMay himself paced his office that night, knowing that if this failed, if the Japanese had secret night fighters, or if the low-level flak was as bad as feared, he would lose the entire 21st Bomber Command in a single evening. He famously remarked that if the war was lost, he'd be tried as a war criminal, but he also believed that this was the only way to end the slaughter of a land invasion. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, 334 silver giants roared down the coral runways. They weren't the high-altitude snipers of a month ago. They were low-level arsonists. They flew into the darkness, stripped of their armor, but laden with more fire than any fleet in history. They were heading towards a city that had ignored the air warnings, thinking the Americans were still trapped in the clouds. They were about to find out that the rules of the war had changed forever, and the invincible Superfortress was finally ready to earn its name, at a cost the world would never forget. If you had been standing in the streets of Tokyo on the evening of March 9, 1945, you might have felt a strange, misplaced sense of security. The city was exhausted, yes, blackouts were a way of life, and the diet was down to meager rations of rice and sweet potatoes. But the populace had developed a certain shelter fatigue. For months, the B-29s had appeared high overhead like silver ghosts, their vapor trails etching beautiful, harmless lines across the blue sky. The sirens would wail, people would dutifully file into their shallow backyard trenches, and more often than not, nothing would happen. The bombs would fall into the bay or explode harmlessly in the foothills. The great superfortress seemed more like a nuisance than a harbinger of doom. That complacency was the result of a fatal misunderstanding of American intent and a technological gap that the Japanese High Command couldn't bridge. As night fell on March 9th, the Japanese radar operators on the outer islands did their jobs. They picked up the massive swarm of bombers rising from the Marianas. They sent the warnings up the chain. The sirens in Tokyo did, in fact, cry out around 10:30 p.m. But as the minutes ticked by and no bombs fell, the city relaxed. Many of us remember a time when technology felt more predictable, but in 1945, the Japanese defense system was built for a different war. Their radar was primitive compared to the Allied sets, and they struggled to track individual planes flying at varying altitudes. When the lead B-29s reached the city, they weren't flying in the massive, easy-to-track boxes the Japanese were used to. They came in low, hugging the terrain, slipping under the effective sweep of many coastal batteries. To the observers on the ground, the initial radar blips looked like a small scouting force, perhaps just a dozen planes. They thought it was another nuisance raid. The civil defense authorities made a catastrophic error. They sounded the all clear or simply let the warnings lapse. in the densely packed district of Shitamachi, where 100,000 people lived per square mile in houses made of wood, paper, and bamboo. People went back to sleep. They tucked their children into futons, convinced that the night would be as quiet as the ones before. They had no way of knowing that while the sirens were silent, 334 bombers were currently fanning out, forming a massive X over the most flammable neighborhoods in the world. The vulnerability of Tokyo wasn't just in its lack of radar, it was in its very DNA. It was a tinderbox. Because of the cottage industry mentioned earlier, almost every residential street doubled as a machine shop. Piles of oil-soaked rags, wooden crates, and volatile chemicals were tucked into every alleyway. The Japanese government had encouraged a neighborhood association system where citizens were expected to fight fires with hand pumps and buckets of sand. It was a medieval defense against a 20th century apocalypse. The silence of the sirens was about to be replaced by the sound no human had ever heard. At precisely 12:08 a.m., the first Pathfinder, piloted by Brigadier General Power, banked over the target. He didn't look for a factory. He looked for the intersection of two major roads in the heart of the working-class district. He opened his bomb bays and released a string of M47 incendiaries.
These weren't the high explosives people were used to. These were canisters of napalm and magnesium that didn't just explode, they splattered. As the first fires blossomed into a giant glowing X on the ground, the rest of the fleet followed the light. The citizens of Tokyo woke up not to the sound of sirens, but to the smell of burning wood and the sudden, terrifying realization that the sky was no longer black. It was bright as noon, and the air was beginning to hum with the vibration of 1,000 engines. The tragedy of the ignored warnings became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the first wave met almost no resistance and the city was caught off guard, the bombers were able to drop their payloads with terrifying accuracy. Without the distraction of heavy flak or night fighters, which were mostly grounded because the Japanese command was still confused by the low-altitude approach, the B-29 crews could take their time. They lined up their runs as if they were on a practice range. By the time the full weight of the sirens finally screamed back to life, it was too late. The fires had already linked up. The all-clear that had been felt just an hour prior was now a death sentence for the thousands trapped in the center of the X. The silence of the night was over, replaced by a firestorm so hot it would melt the asphalt in the streets and boil the water in the canals. The $3 billion gamble had arrived, and Tokyo was about to pay the price for a silence that should have been a scream. When we think of aerial bombardment, we often picture the massive blockbusters of the European theater, huge, steel-cased bombs designed to shatter concrete and twist I-beams. But as the B-29s lowered their flaps over Tokyo, they weren't carrying those. They were carrying a weapon specifically engineered for the unique architecture of Japan. This was the M69 incendiary, and its effectiveness was the result of a cold, calculated marriage between chemical engineering and psychological warfare. The M69 wasn't just a firebomb, it was a delivery system for a terrifying new substance called napalm. History suggests that the scientists at Harvard who developed it were looking for something that wouldn't just burn, but would cling. Traditional oil bombs burned out too quickly, often failing to ignite heavy timbers. The M69 was a masterpiece of lethal design. It was a hexagonal steel pipe about 20 inches long, filled with cheesecloth socks soaked in gasoline thickened with napalm. These pipes were bundled together into E46 clusters. When dropped from the B-29, the cluster would break apart in midair, scattering the individual pipes like a handful of deadly darts. To ensure they hit the ground nose first, each pipe deployed a long paper streamer to act as a tail. This wasn't a random scattering, it was a calibrated saturation.
The tactical brutality of the night was found in how these weapons behaved upon impact. Unlike a standard bomb that explodes on contact, the M69 had a delayed action fuse. When it hit a rooftop, usually a thin layer of tile and wood, it would punch through into the attic or the living quarters. Then, after a 3 to 5 second delay, a small charge of black powder would ignite, firing the napalm-soaked sock out of the back of the pipe like a flaming projectile. Imagine being a family huddled in your home, hearing the thud of a metal pipe hitting your roof, followed by a momentary silence. Then, suddenly, your entire living room is coated in a sticky, gelatinous fire that cannot be smothered. It sticks to the walls, the floor, and the clothing of anyone nearby. Because the napalm was thickened, it didn't just run off, it stayed where it landed, burning at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. As thousands of these pipes rained down on the Shitamachi district, they didn't create a series of small fires, they created a carpet of flame. Within 30 minutes of the first drop, the individual fires began to merge. This is the point where the tactical brutality shifted from a military operation to a natural disaster of human making. The sheer scale of the heat began to create its own weather. The fires consumed so much oxygen so quickly that they created a vacuum, drawing in cold air from the surrounding areas with the force of a gale. This created a firestorm, a self-sustaining vortex of heat and wind. Many survivors later recalled that the wind was so strong it literally blew people off their feet and into the flames. The temperature in the center of the target zone reached 1,800 degrees. This was hot enough to melt the glass in windows, melt the lead in the pipes, and turn the city's canals into boiling vats. The B-29 pilots, flying at just 5,000 feet, felt the brutality of their own weapon. The updrafts from the firestorm were so violent that they tossed the 60-ton bombers like paper planes. The cockpits filled with the smell of burning wood and scorched earth. Some pilots reported that the heat was so intense they had to wear their oxygen masks just to breathe the cooled, pressurized air inside the cabin. The M69 achieved in one night what the high-altitude precision bombing had failed to do in 6 months. It didn't just destroy factories, it obliterated the social and physical fabric of the enemy's capital. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo, roughly the size of Manhattan, had been erased from the map. Over 100,000 people had perished, a number higher than the immediate death tolls of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The tactical brutality was no longer a theory, it was a smoldering reality. The Air Force had found its win, but at a cost that would haunt the men who flew that night for the rest of their lives. They had used the most advanced technology in the world to unleash the most primitive of elements, and in doing so, they had fundamentally changed the nature of modern warfare.
When the sun finally rose over the Pacific on the morning of March 11, 1945, the crews of the 21st Bomber Command were landing back on the coral strips of Tinian and Saipan. They stepped out of their pressurized cabins not with the triumphant roar of conquerors, but with a hollow, stunned silence. Many of them were covered in a fine layer of gray soot that had seeped into the cockpits over Tokyo, the literal ashes of a city carried back across the ocean on the wings of their B-29s. They had set out to prove the worth of a $3 billion machine, and they had succeeded. The success of Operation Meetinghouse carried a weight that no ledger could balance. As the reconnaissance photos began to develop, showing 16 square miles of ash where a world capital had stood, the men in the high command had to reckon with what they had unleashed. They had traded the gentlemanly ideal of precision bombing for the blunt force trauma of total war.
To many of us who grew up in the shadow of that conflict, we were taught that this was the necessary price of peace, the hard choice required to prevent an even bloodier invasion of the Japanese home islands. History suggests, however, that the legacy of those silver wings is more complex than a simple victory. The firebombing of Tokyo didn't just break buildings, it shattered the global consensus on what was permissible in aerial warfare. Before March 9th, the United States had largely criticized the indiscriminate area bombing practiced by other nations. After that night, the threshold for destruction was moved. The firestorm in Tokyo became the blueprint for the destruction of 66 more Japanese cities, a relentless campaign of fire that led directly to the doorstep of the atomic age. When we look back at the B-29 today, we see a machine that exists in two worlds. It is a masterpiece of American engineering, the ancestor of every pressurized jetliner we fly in today, a testament to what our country can achieve when it moves as one. It represents the bravery of the greatest generation pilots who flew into the unknown, stripped of their defenses, betting their lives on a general's radical gamble. It also serves as a somber reminder of the law of unintended consequences. We built a plane to fly at 30,000 feet and hit a pickle barrel, but nature forced us down to 5,000 feet to burn a city. We spent billions on a tool of precision, only to find that in the chaos of war, the most effective tool is often the most brutal. As the years have passed, the echoes of those engines have faded, and the men who flew them are becoming fewer each day. But the lesson of the invisible wall remains. It reminds us that no matter how much we spend on technology, and no matter how advanced our bomb sites become, we are always at the mercy of forces, both atmospheric and human, that we cannot fully control. The story of the B-29 and the fires over Tokyo isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a testament to a generation that was forced to adapt when the world didn't work the way it was promised. Many of us have our own memories of these planes, or perhaps stories passed down from fathers and uncles who saw those silver wings firsthand. If you found value in this deep dive into the invisible wall and the gambles of the Pacific, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and join our community. We're dedicated to preserving these complex histories with the respect they deserve. Before you go, I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe the pivot to low-altitude bombing was a necessary evil, or was the cost of abandoning precision too high? Your perspective helps keep these stories alive for the next generation. Thank you for spending your time with us today.